They say freezing to death is like falling asleep. They're lying. It burns. It feels like 1,000 knives slicing through your skin, each one carving deeper than the last, before the darkness finally swallows you whole. The cold doesn't gently rock you to sleep. It tears you apart from the inside out, clawing at your lungs, your heart, your very soul, until there's nothing left but the quiet hum of a world that has already forgotten your name. Ethan Cole knew this better than most. He'd spent 26 years learning exactly how cold the world could be. The receipt crumpled in his frozen fingers, the ink smudged from the dampness that had soaked through his threadbare jacket. $48.73. That was his take-home for a double shift at the Rusty Spoon, a diner on 35th that smelled like stale coffee and regret. The money wasn't enough to cover his overdue rent, let alone the heating bill that had been sitting on his counter for 3 weeks, yellow and accusing like a judgment he couldn't escape. November in Chicago was a physical assault. The wind ripped off Lake Michigan like a personal vendetta, finding every gap in his worn denim jacket, every exposed inch of skin, every reason to remind him that he was nothing. Just another Omega struggling to survive in a city that ate people like him for breakfast and spit out the bones. Ethan pulled his scarf tighter, ducking his head against the assault as he walked along the Wacker Drive Bridge. The scarf was a gift from his mother, back when she still remembered his name, back before the dementia had stolen her piece by piece. It was the only thing he had left of her, and some nights, when the loneliness became too much, he would bury his face in the worn wool and pretend she was still there, still proud of the Omega son she'd raised alone. 2 a.m. The city was asleep, save for the distant hum of traffic on the I-90 and the occasional siren that wailed through the night like something dying in the dark. The streetlights cast their sickly yellow glow over the empty riverwalk below, painting everything in shades of decay and neglect. Ethan stopped at the railing, looking down at the Chicago River churning silently below. It looked like black oil, thick and unrelenting, swallowing the reflection of the city lights without giving anything back. Just one break, he whispered, his breath forming a white cloud that dissolved almost instantly. I just need one break. He'd been saying that for years. First when his father left, then when his mother got sick, then when his suppressants ran out and he couldn't afford to refill the prescription, then when his landlord threatened eviction, then when, well, there was always another then. Another moment where the universe seemed to conspire against him, reminding him that being an unbonded Omega in a world designed for alphas and betas meant you were always one step away from disaster. But he couldn't lose hope. Hope was all he had left. He was about to turn away when he heard it. Not a scream. A splash. Heavy and unnatural. The kind of sound that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of the night. Ethan squinted into the darkness below, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. The river walk was deserted, bathed in that same sickly yellow glow. And then he saw the taillights of a black SUV peeling away from the lower service road, tires screeching against the asphalt like an animal in pain. And there, bobbing in the freezing current, was a patch of beige. A coat. A small coat. Oh my God, Ethan gasped. He didn't think. If he'd thought, he would have remembered that he was an Omega with no health insurance and no one to call if things went wrong. He would have remembered that the river temperature was hovering near 40 degrees, cold enough to kill in minutes. He would have remembered that his scent was still too strong, his suppressants still too expensive, and if he got sick, there was no one to take care of him. But he didn't think. He just moved. His boots slipped on the icy maintenance stairs as he scrambled down, the metal biting into his palms through his gloves. When he reached the concrete edge of the river, he saw him. A boy, no older than 6, thrashing weakly in the black water. The heavy wool coat he was wearing was dragging him down, pulling him under with each desperate, failing kick. Hey, hold on, Ethan screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. The boy's head went under. He didn't come back up. Ethan kicked off his boots, ignoring the bite of the frozen concrete against his feet. He took a breath that tasted of exhaust and freezing rain, and then he dove. The shock was immediate. It hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest, stealing the air from his lungs, squeezing the warmth from his limbs. The cold was paralyzing, worse than anything he'd ever imagined, 1,000 knives slicing through his skin just like they'd promised. His jeans soaked up the water like lead weights, dragging him down into the murky darkness. "Move," he screamed internally. "Move or die." He kicked downward, eyes stinging in the filth, lungs burning with a need for oxygen. He groped blindly in the dark, fingers scraping against nothing until, wool. Soft, expensive wool. He grabbed the collar of the coat and kicked for the surface with everything he had. His lungs were screaming. His vision was going black at the edges, and then they broke the surface. Ethan gasped, sucking in air that felt like broken glass, water streaming from his hair, his face, his lungs. The boy was limp in his arms, pale and lifeless, a broken doll in the freezing water. "No, no, no," Ethan chanted, dragging him toward the concrete embankment. His hands were raw, scraped from the rough surface as he hauled the boy up onto the freezing pavement. He dragged himself up after him, collapsing beside the small body. The boy was so pale. His lips were blue, his skin waxy and cold. He looked like a porcelain doll, expensive and perfect and shattered. Ethan immediately started CPR, pressing down on the small chest with trembling hands. "Come on," he gritted out, his voice cracking with desperation. "Don't you do this. Don't you die on me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. 1, 2, 3, 4. He pinched the boy's nose and breathed into his mouth, tasting river water and copper. The taste of failure. "Breathe," he screamed, tears of frustration and cold freezing on his cheeks. "Breathe, damn it." A convulsion shook the small body. The boy gagged, turned his head, and vomited water onto the concrete. Ethan fell back, sobbing with relief. Okay, you're good. I've got you." The boy looked at him. His eyes were dark, terrified, and incredibly old for such a young face. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just shivered violently, his small body trembling against the frozen pavement. Ethan pulled him into his lap, trying to share his body heat, even though he had none left to give. His Omega instincts were screaming at him, a primal urge to protect, to comfort, to wrap this vulnerable little creature in warmth and safety. But he was so cold himself, so desperately, dangerously cold. "Stay awake," Ethan chattered, his teeth knocking together. "What's your name?" "I'm Ethan." "Can you tell me your name?" The boy remained silent, his small hand gripping Ethan's wet shirt with a strength that surprised him. "Please," Ethan whispered. "Just stay awake. Help is coming." Help is. Lights. Blue and red, flashing against the limestone of the bridge. An ambulance siren cut through the night, and Ethan had never heard a more beautiful sound. "Over here," he yelled, waving a freezing arm. 2 paramedics rushed down the stairs, followed by a police officer. They swarmed the boy, wrapping him in thermal blankets, putting an oxygen mask on his face. He was under for maybe 30 seconds, Ethan stammered, his vision blurring. I saw a car drive away." "We've got him, sir," one paramedic said, lifting the boy onto a stretcher. The boy reached out for him, his eyes wide with panic as they pulled him away. His small fingers grasped at the air, reaching for Ethan like he was the only anchor in a storm. "Wait." Ethan tried to stand, but his legs gave out. The world tilted sideways, the adrenaline crash leaving only the cold behind. "Papa. Papa." The last thing he saw was the flashing red lights reflecting off the black water, before the darkness swallowed him whole. When Ethan woke up, it was to the smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of a monitor. He blinked, his eyes gritty and raw. He was in a hospital bed, wearing a scratchy gown, a heavy wool blanket tucked up to his chin. The room was sterile and white, the kind of place that smelled like bleach and despair. Northwestern Memorial. He recognized the view out the window. He'd cleaned floors here 2 years ago, back when he'd had a job that didn't involve serving coffee to men who thought an Omega's place was on their knees. A nurse in blue scrubs bustled in, her scent a mild beta neutral that barely registered in Ethan's senses. "Oh, good, you're awake." You gave us quite a scare, honey. Severe hypothermia. Ethan sat up, ignoring the headache that throbbed behind his eyes. The boy, he croaked, his throat feeling like sandpaper. How is the boy? The nurse paused, checking Ethan's foredrip. She frowned. The boy? The kid I pulled out of the river, Ethan said, urgency rising in his chest. Is he okay? He was so cold. His lips were blue. I did CPR. The nurse looked at him with an expression of genuine confusion. Honey, you were brought in alone. The police report said a patrol car found you passed out on the riverwalk. There was no boy. Ethan froze. What? No, I pulled him out. The paramedics took him first. He was wearing a beige coat, Burberry, I think. The nurse patted his hand patronizingly. Trauma can do funny things to the memory. You were hallucinating from the cold. There's no record of a child admission last night from your sector. I'm not crazy, Ethan snapped, ripping the tape off his hand to adjust the four. He was there. I did CPR on him. Mr. Cole, please. Calm down, or I'll have to call security. The nurse's tone was firm, but there was something in her eyes, pity, maybe, or discomfort. Rest. You're lucky to be alive. The nurse left the room, and Ethan sat in the silence, his heart pounding against his ribs. He wasn't crazy. He couldn't be crazy. He looked at his hands. They were scraped raw, the skin red and angry. He closed his eyes, and he could still feel the weight of the boy in his arms, the smell of expensive wool, the terror in those dark eyes. The way the boy had reached for him, desperate and afraid. No, he wasn't crazy. He swung his legs out of bed, ignoring the dizziness that washed over him. He needed to leave. He needed to find out what happened. As he reached for his clothes, which were folded neatly on a chair, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It must have been tucked into the pocket of his jeans, which were now dry and stiff. Ethan picked it up. It wasn't paper. It was a card, heavy cream-colored stock, expensive. There was no name, just a symbol embossed in black ink, a wolf with a dagger in its jaws, and a phone number written in sharp, angular handwriting. And on the back, 3 words. For your silence. Ethan stared at the card. The nurse said there was no boy. The police report said he was alone. But someone had put this in his pocket while he was unconscious. He wasn't crazy. He'd saved someone important. And apparently, someone very powerful wanted the world to think that boy was dead. 3 days later, Ethan was back at the Rusty Spoon. He hadn't called a number. He'd shoved the card into an old cigar box under his bed and tried to forget about it. But his life had a way of not letting him forget things. Table 4 needs a refill, and stop daydreaming. Sal bellowed from the kitchen window. Sal was a sweaty beta who smelled of onions and old grease, and he had no patience for omegas who couldn't keep up. On it, Sal, Ethan muttered, grabbing the coffee pot. He felt like he was being watched. He felt it ever since he left the hospital, a prickly sensation on the back of his neck, the certain knowledge that he wasn't alone. When he walked home, he saw cars slowing down. When he was in his apartment, he heard footsteps in the hallway that stopped right outside his door. He poured coffee for a trucker who winked at him. Ethan ignored him, keeping his scent carefully neutral, suppressed by the cheap blockers that barely worked. As an unbonded Omega, he couldn't afford to draw attention. Not in this neighborhood. Not in this city. As he turned to head back to the counter, the bell above the diner door jingled. The noise in the diner didn't stop, but the atmosphere changed instantly. It was as if the air pressure dropped, the temperature plummeted. Every alpha in the room tensed, their instincts screaming at them to submit or fight. 2 men walked in. They were out of place. Sal's was a place for flannel shirts, work boots, and desperation. These men wore suits that cost more than the building, Italian cut, charcoal gray, tailored to hide the holsters Ethan knew were there. They didn't look for a table. They looked at him. One of them, a mountain of a man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, walked straight to the counter. His scent was alpha, dark and menacing, the kind that made Omega instincts scream danger, danger, run. Ethan Cole, he asked, his voice like gravel grinding together. Who's asking? Ethan gripped the coffee pot handle tighter, using it as a shield. Our employer would like a word. It wasn't a request. I'm on shift, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. And I don't know your employer. He knows you. The man's eyes flickered with something cold and amused. He knows you went swimming the other night. Ethan's blood ran cold. The diner suddenly felt very small. Sal poked his head out of the kitchen, saw the suits, saw the grim expressions, and immediately ducked back in. Coward, Ethan thought. I don't want any trouble, he whispered. Then come with us. The man gestured toward the door. The car is outside. Ethan looked out the grease-stained window. A matte black Mercedes G-Wagon was idling at the curb, its windows tinted so dark they looked like mirrors. And if I say no? The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Cole, you hold a debt. We're just here to collect. Ethan knew then that he didn't have a choice. If they wanted to hurt him, they would have done it already. They wanted something else. Something that required him alive and conscious. Let me get my coat, he said. The drive took 40 minutes. They headed north, away from the grime of the city, toward the sprawling estates of Lake Forest. The houses here weren't houses. They were fortresses of stone and glass, hidden behind iron gates and high hedges. Security cameras watched their every move. The car turned into a driveway that looked more like a private road. They passed a security checkpoint where armed guards nodded at the driver, their scents alpha and dangerous, and Ethan felt his Omega instincts coil tighter in his chest. The estate that came into view was terrifyingly beautiful. Modern Gothic, dark stone and sharp angles, looming against the gray sky like something out of a nightmare. The grounds were immaculate, the windows dark and reflective. The car stopped. The scarred man opened her door. Inside, library. Second door on the left. Ethan walked up the steps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The front doors opened before he touched them. The interior was vast, cold, and silent. Marble floors reflected his cheap sneakers, and somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked with the slow inevitability of a heartbeat. He walked to the library, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the kind that belonged in a museum rather than a home. A fire roared in a massive stone hearth, the only source of warmth in the house. Standing by the window with his back to Ethan was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his white dress shirt. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and the scent that rolled off him was unmistakable. Alpha. Not just any alpha. An alpha of power and control, the kind whose very presence demanded submission. But it wasn't the power that made Ethan freeze. It was the scent itself. Dark, complex, with notes of sandalwood and whiskey and something else, something that made his Omega instinct sit up and pay attention. It was the scent of an unmarked alpha, and it was intoxicating. Sit, the man commanded, his voice low, baritone, vibrating through the room. Ethan remained standing. I prefer to stand. The man turned around, and Ethan's breath hitched. He was devastatingly handsome, in a way that was almost painful to look at. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline covered in a shadow of stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent. But his face was edged with exhaustion and a simmering controlled rage that made Ethan's instinct scream danger. This was Dante Valeni. Ethan knew the face. Everyone in Chicago knew the face, though usually it was on the news regarding alleged racketeering charges that never stuck or charity galas that were fronts for money laundering. The head of the Valenti crime syndicate. De capo di tutti capi. You're younger than I expected, Dante said, his eyes scanning Ethan, dissecting him. And poor. I work for a living, Ethan snapped, his fear momentarily replaced by defensiveness. Unlike some people. Dante's eyes narrowed. He took a sip from the tumbler in his hand, the amber liquid catching the firelight. You have a sharp tongue, Omega. Be careful not to cut yourself with it. The word Omega was a weapon, and Dante wielded it like one. It was a reminder of exactly where Ethan stood in the hierarchy of the world. Dante walked over to his desk and picked up a tablet. He tapped the screen and turned it toward Ethan. It was a grainy video. Security footage. It showed the riverwalk. The boy falling. Ethan diving in. Ethan saving him. I've watched this 50 times, Dante said quietly. My security team, they failed. My son was taken from his bed, drugged, and thrown off a bridge by a rival faction. They intended to send me a message. A dead air. He set the tablet down. But you. He stepped closer, invading Ethan's personal space. Ethan could smell him now, sandalwood and whiskey and danger. The scent was overwhelming, making his Omega instincts war between fear and fascination. You ruined their message. I just did what anyone would do, Ethan said, backing up until his legs hit a leather armchair. No. Dante corrected, his gray eyes boring into Ethan's. Most people would have walked away. Or filmed it for social media. You jumped into near-freezing water. You saved my son. You risked your life for a child you didn't know. His scent intensified, flooding the room with a possessive edge that made Ethan's knees weak. Where is he? Ethan asked. The boy. Leo. He remembered seeing the name in the papers years ago, back when the Valenti family was still making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Dante's expression softened, just for a fraction of a second. He's alive. Physically, he's recovering. Mentally, he trailed off, the mask of the cold boss slipping to reveal something raw and vulnerable beneath. He hasn't spoken a word since that night. He screams if anyone touches him. Doctors, nurses, even me. He looked at Ethan with an intensity that made his breath catch. Except you. Ethan blinked. What? The paramedics told me, Dante said. He held on to you. He wouldn't let go. You're the only person he's responded to. He walked back to his desk and picked up a piece of paper, sliding it across the mahogany surface. I have a proposition for you, Mr. Cole. Ethan looked at the paper. It was a contract. I need someone Leo trusts. I need someone to watch him, be with him, 24/7. I can't trust my guards. One of them let him be taken. I can't trust the nannies. They're spies or incompetent. I'm a waiter, Ethan said. I'm not a nanny. And I'm definitely not a mob wife. Dante's lip curled in dry amusement. I'm not asking for a wife. I'm asking for a caretaker. He pointed to the bottom of the page. The salary is $10,000 a month, plus room and board here, plus full health insurance. And suppressants, he added, his voice dropping. The best ones. Whatever you need. Ethan's jaw dropped. 10,000. That changed everything. That was his debt paid. That was a new life. And if I refuse, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Then you leave, Dante said coldly. And you go back to your diner and your overdue rent and your empty life. And you hope that the men who threw my son off that bridge don't find out that you're the witness who saw their car. The threat hung in the air. It wasn't a threat from him. It was a statement of fact. Ethan was already involved. There was no going back. Why me? He asked softly. Because you saved him. Dante's voice dropped to a whisper, and for a moment, the mask slipped entirely. And because I owe you a debt. A Valenti always pays his debts. Ethan looked at the contract. He looked at Dante, this dangerous, broken man. He thought of the little boy with the terrified eyes, the way he'd gripped Ethan's shirt like he was the only safe thing in the world. He picked up the pen. I have conditions, he said. Dante raised an eyebrow. You're in no position to negotiate, Mr. Cole. I want no guns around the boy, Ethan said firmly. And I want to be able to leave the property on weekends. Dante studied him for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then he nodded once. Agreed. Ethan signed his name. Welcome to the family, Ethan. Dante said the name like it was a secret he was keeping, and the sound of it sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Now come. Leo is waiting. The Valenti estate was beautiful, but it was a tomb. That was Ethan's first assessment after 48 hours inside. The walls, the floors, everything was marble, chilling his feet through his socks. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of grandfather clocks that cost more than his entire life's earnings. His room was adjacent to Leo's suite. It was luxurious, a four-poster bed, silk sheets, a bathroom with a tub the size of a swimming pool. The windows were made of bulletproof glass, and the door locked from the outside as well as the inside. He wasn't a guest. He was a high-paid prisoner. But that was fine. He was used to cages. He'd been in one his whole life, just a different kind. Ethan stood in the doorway of Leo's room. The boy was sitting on the floor, surrounded by untouched toys. Lego sets, remote-controlled cars, tablets, everything a child could possibly want. But he wasn't playing. He was staring at the wall, rocking slightly back and forth, his dark eyes empty. "Hey, Leo," Ethan said softly, sitting down on the carpet a few feet away. He didn't crowd him. He'd learned that quickly. If he got too close, the boy flinched. Leo didn't look at him. "I brought you something." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, cheap plastic object. A fidget spinner, bright neon green. It looked ridiculous against the Persian rug, but it was all he had. "Found it in my bag. Used to help me think when the diner got loud." He spun it. Whir. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Leo stopped rocking. His dark eyes flickered toward the spinning green blur. "You can try it," Ethan said, sliding it across the floor. Leo stared at it until it stopped spinning. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached out and flicked it. It spun again, and a tiny, almost imperceptible breath of relief escaped the boy's lips. "Mr. Cole." Ethan jumped. A woman was standing in the doorway, Greta, the head housekeeper. She was a severe beta in her 60s, with hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She looked at Ethan with thinly veiled disdain. "It's Mr. Cole," Ethan corrected, standing up. "Mr. Valenti requests your presence in the dining room." "Dinner is served." Greta's voice was stiff, formal. "Leo will eat in his room, as usual." "No," Ethan said. Greta blinked. "Excuse me?" "Leo eats with his father." Ethan surprised himself with his own boldness. "He's terrified, Greta. Isolating him isn't helping. He needs to know he's safe. Mr. Valenti prefers." "I don't care what he prefers. I'm the caretaker." Ethan walked over to Leo and held out his hand. "Leo." "Hungry?" The boy looked at his hand, then at the door, then slowly, he stood up and gripped Ethan's pinky finger. Greta's mouth formed a thin line, but she stepped aside. The dining room was cavernous, with a table long enough to seat 20. Dante sat at the head, a glass of red wine in front of him, reading a dossier. He looked up when they entered, his gray eyes widening slightly when he saw his son. "He's eating with us," Ethan announced, pulling out a heavy oak chair for Leo, right next to Dante. Not at the far end. Dante looked at Ethan, then at the terrified boy. Slowly, he closed the dossier. Very well. The meal was excruciating. Servants placed plates of roast duck and truffle risotto in front of them. The silence was suffocating. Dante ate with mechanical precision, his scent carefully neutral, but Ethan could sense the tension radiating off him. Leo picked at his food, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. "So," Ethan said, his voice echoing too loudly, "does anyone want to talk about how the Bears are playing?" Dante stopped chewing. He looked at Ethan as if he'd just spoken in tongues. "I don't follow football." "Right, of course. Too busy ruling the underworld." Ethan muttered under his breath, taking a sip of water. "I heard that," Dante said, though a hint of amusement tugged at the corner of his mouth. Suddenly, a loud clatter echoed through the room. Leo had dropped his fork. He froze, his eyes going wide, and looked at Dante with pure, unadulterated terror. It's just a fork, Leo, Dante said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Pick it up. But Leo didn't move. His breathing quickened, his small body trembling. The memories of the water, the violence, the betrayal, all of it was flooding back, triggered by the sudden noise. Ethan was out of his chair in a second. He knelt beside Leo, ignoring the way the boy flinched away from him. Leo, look at me. Look at Ethan. You're safe. You're in the kitchen. No water, just air. Leo grabbed his shoulders, burying his face in Ethan's neck, and then he spoke. Cold, he whispered, his voice raspy and broken. Papa. Cold. Dante froze, his wine glass hovering halfway to his mouth. He stared at his son, who was clinging to the hired help, seeking comfort from an Omega he barely knew. He spoke, Dante whispered. Ethan rubbed Leo's back, his Omega instinct screaming at him to protect, to comfort, to wrap this broken child in warmth and safety. Yeah, he did. He looked up at Dante, his blue eyes fierce. He's not broken, Dante. He's just frozen. And this house, it's the coldest place on earth. Dante set his glass down. The force of it nearly cracked the stem. He looked at the Omega kneeling on his floor, holding his legacy in his arms, challenging him in his own home. Then warm it up, Ethan, he said, his voice low and intense. That's why you're here. 2 weeks passed. The estate, or the mausoleum, as Ethan privately called it, was slowly becoming more bearable. Leo was sleeping better, mostly because Ethan had started reading to him at night, cheap comic books he'd ordered online, doing different voices for the heroes and villains. The boy still didn't speak much, but he'd started reaching for Ethan's hand when he was scared, and that was progress. But while Leo was improving, the atmosphere in the house was deteriorating. Ethan felt eyes on him constantly, not Dante's, though those were intense enough. These were different, malevolent, calculating. The security team. Specifically, Rocco, the head of security. Rocco was a bulldog of a beta who treated Ethan like a security risk. He checked his bags when he came in from the garden. He monitored his phone calls to his mother. His scent was alpha-adjacent, aggressive, and territorial, and Ethan's Omega instinct screamed at him to be wary. But it wasn't just Rocco. It was the house itself. The walls had ears, and Ethan was beginning to realize that he was a lot more trapped than he'd initially thought. One rainy Tuesday, Ethan was cleaning up the nursery. Leo was in therapy with a child psychologist. Dante had flown in from Zurich, and Ethan was alone, picking up Lego blocks and trying not to think about how much his life had changed in 2 weeks. He noticed something odd about Leo's favorite teddy bear. It was vintage, worn at the seams, but there was new stitching on the back, hidden under the vest. Ethan frowned. He picked it up and squeezed it. Something hard inside, not stuffing. He found a pair of nail scissors in the bathroom and carefully snipped the thread. He dug his fingers into the plush and pulled out a small black disc. Bug. A listening device. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew enough from movies and from the general vibe of this house to know this wasn't a baby monitor. Someone had planted this. Someone who wanted to know what was happening in Leo's room. He didn't run to Rocco. If a bug was in the nursery, security had either failed or they were involved. And if they were involved, Rocco was the prime suspect. He marched straight to Dante's office. The guards at the door tried to stop him. Mr. Cole, Mr. Valenti is in a meeting. I don't care. Ethan shoved past them and threw the double doors open. Dante was standing behind his desk, flanked by 2 lieutenants. He looked up, fury flashing his eyes at the interruption. Ethan, this better be life or death. It might be. Ethan walked up to his desk and slammed the black disc down on the mahogany. I found this in Leo's bear. The room went deathly silent. Dante looked at the device. His face didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at his lieutenants. Leave us. Boss, we can. Now. The men scrambled out. Dante picked up the device, examining it with a terrifying familiarity. It's a long-range transmitter, he said quietly. Sophisticated. Not police. This is cartel tech. He looked up at Ethan. Who's been in the nursery? Me, the cleaning crew, and your security team, Ethan said, crossing his arms. Rocco checks that room every morning. Dante's jaw tightened. Rocco has been with me for 10 years. And Judas was with Jesus for 3. Ethan shot back. Someone put that there, Dante. Someone who knows Leo sleeps with that bear. Someone who wants to know where you're keeping him. Dante stood up and walked around the desk, stopping inches from Ethan. The height difference was intimidating. He towered over him, his alpha presence filling the room, making Ethan's instincts scream at him to submit. But Ethan refused to back down. You're accusing my head of security of treason, Dante said softly. I'm accusing someone of targeting a 6-year-old boy. Ethan's voice was shaking, but he held his ground. And I don't care about your loyalty codes or your omerta. I care that Leo is safe. And right now, he's sleeping with a target on his back. Dante stared at him. For a moment, Ethan thought he might strike him or fire him. Instead, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind Ethan's ear. His fingers were rough and warm, and the touch sent a shockwave of electricity through Ethan's body that had nothing to do with fear. You have good instincts, Ethan, he murmured, his thumb grazing Ethan's cheekbone. Better than my men. I'm just observant, Ethan stammered, his breath hitching. You're dangerous, Dante corrected. Because you make me trust you. And I don't trust anyone. The moment hung there, thick with unspoken tension. The air crackled with a magnetic pull, Dante's scent intensifying, flooding Ethan's senses with sandalwood and whiskey and something darker, something possessive. Ethan found himself leaning in, just a fraction. Dante's gaze dropped to his lips. Then the door burst open. It was Rocco. Boss, we have a problem at the docks. He stopped, seeing the intimacy of the moment, or choosing to ignore it. Dante stepped back instantly, the mask of the dawn sliding back into place. He swiped the bug off the desk and into his pocket in one fluid motion. Handle it, Rocco, Dante said, his voice ice cold. And then come see me. We need to discuss new security protocols for the nursery. Rocco nodded, but his eyes lingered on Ethan. There was no warmth there, only calculation. As Rocco left, Dante turned back to Ethan. Go back to Leo. Do not leave his side. Do not eat anything that isn't prepared by Greta personally. Do you understand? Ethan whispered, his voice trembling slightly. What are you going to do? Dante turned to the window, looking out at the gray Chicago skyline. I'm going to find a rat, he said. And I'm going to exterminate it. The tension in the house broke 3 days later, but not in the way Ethan hoped. I have to go where? Ethan stared at the dress hanging on his wardrobe door. It was a gown of midnight blue silk, sleek and backless, with a slit that went up to his thigh. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. It also terrified him. The Valeni Foundation Charity Gala, Dante said. He was leaning against Ethan's doorframe, adjusting his cuff links. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, and Ethan couldn't help but notice how good he looked. How his scent seemed to fill the room, making Ethan's Omega instinct sit up and pay attention. I can't go to a gala, Dante. I don't know which fork to use. I'm a waiter from the South Side. You're Leo's guardian, Dante said, and the word guardian made Ethan's heart skip. And Leo must make an appearance. Rumors are circulating that he's brain dead or crippled. Our enemies smell blood in the water. We need to show them he's strong. That we're strong. So I'm a prop? Ethan asked, feeling a sting of hurt. No. Dante walked over to him, taking the hanger from his hand. You're his shield. He won't walk into that room without you. He made that very clear. Ethan sighed, looking at the dress. Do I have to wear heels? Ideally. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel. It was a sea of diamonds, tuxedos, and fake smiles. Ethan felt like an imposter. The dress fit perfectly. Dante had guessed his size with unnerving accuracy, but he felt exposed, vulnerable. He held Leo's hand tightly. The boy was wearing a miniature tuxedo, looking adorable but pale. His scent was anxious, and Ethan could feel his own omega instinct screaming to protect, to comfort. "Head up," Dante whispered in his ear as they entered the ballroom. His hand rested on the small of Ethan's back, a burning brand of possession. "If you look frightened, they'll eat you alive." "Who are they?" Ethan whispered back through a smile. "Everyone," Dante replied. The night was a blur of flashes and handshakes. Dante introduced him simply as Ethan, Leo's governess, and the words felt like a dismissal, a reminder of exactly where Ethan stood. He saw the looks the society wives gave him, judgmental, curious, jealous. He saw the looks the men gave him, hungry. Dante stayed close, his presence a dark barrier between Ethan and the world. Around 10 p.m., the crowd parted. A man approached, older than Dante, with silver hair and a face that looked like it was carved from granite. "Dante," the man said, spreading his arms. "So good to see the boy is functional." "Salvatore." Dante nodded, his body tensing. "He's better than functional. He's thriving." This was Salvatore Moretti, the rival boss, the man Dante suspected of ordering the hit. Ethan could smell him, an alpha, powerful and dangerous, his scent tinged with something oily and unpleasant. Salvatore looked down at Leo. "Hello, little one." "You remember Uncle Sal." Leo shrank back behind Ethan's legs. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself physically between the old man and the boy. "He's tired, sir." "Back off." The room went silent. Salvatore's eyes snapped to Ethan, gleaming with something cold and predatory. "And who is this spirited creature?" "He's with me," Dante said, his voice low, but carrying across the room like a gunshot. "Touch him, Sal, and we'll have a war right here on the dance floor." Salvatore laughed, holding up his hands. "Easy, Dante." Just admiring the help. He leaned in close to Ethan, his cologne overpowering. "Be careful, sweetheart. The Valentis have a history of getting their Omega lovers killed." He walked away, his entourage trailing him. Ethan was shaking. Dante turned to him, his eyes blazing. "Take Leo to the car." "No." "Rocco is waiting at the back exit." "What? Why?" "Because Sal just gave the signal," Dante said, scanning the room. "We're leaving." Ethan grabbed Leo's hand and moved toward the kitchen exit, his heart pounding. He pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. It was empty. Too empty. "Rocco," he called out. The back door opened. But it wasn't Rocco. It was two men in catering uniforms wearing ski masks. They held silenced pistols. "Hand over the kid," one of them said. Ethan shoved Leo behind a stainless steel prep table, his Omega instinct screaming at him to protect, to fight, to survive. He looked around for a weapon, a knife block, a frying pan, anything. "I said, give us the kid." The man lunged. Ethan didn't think. He reacted. He grabbed a pot of boiling stock off the stove and threw it. The man screamed as the scalding liquid hit his face. He fired blindly. Pop, pop, and a bullet sparked off the metal table inches from Leo's head. Ethan grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet as the second man aimed. He swung it with all the strength of Omega, who'd carried heavy trays for 6 years. Crack. He hit the man's wrist, and the gun skittered across the floor. "Run, Leo!" Ethan screamed. But the first man, his face red and blistering, was getting up. He raised his gun at Ethan. "Bitch," he snarled. Ethan closed his eyes, waiting for the burn. Bang. The shot was loud, unsilenced. Ethan opened his eyes. The man dropped, a hole in the center of his forehead. Standing in the doorway, smoking gun in hand, was Dante. Behind him, Rocco lay on the floor, bleeding from a knife wound to the gut. Dante walked over to the dead man and kicked the gun away. He looked at Ethan, covered in stock, holding a frying pan, standing over a traumatized boy. You, Dante said, breathing hard, are the most incredible Omega I have ever met. Rocco, Ethan pointed to the door. Rocco took a knife from me, Dante said grimly. He wasn't the rat. He looked at the kitchen staff entrance. The rat is still here. And he just tried to finish the job. Dante grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him and Leo close. The war has started, he whispered into Ethan's hair. And there's nowhere left to hide. The drive back to the estate was a blur of speed and silence. Dante drove the bulletproof SUV himself, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Ethan sat in the back with Leo asleep on his lap, stroking his hair with trembling hands. The adrenaline from the kitchen was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. When they arrived, the estate was already in lockdown. Floodlights swept the grounds. Men with assault rifles patrolled the perimeter. It looked less like a home and more like a besieged fortress. Take Leo upstairs, Dante commanded as soon as they entered the foyer. Lock the door. Open it for no one but me. Dante, your hand. Ethan noticed blood dripping from his sleeve. It's a graze. Go. Ethan didn't argue. He carried the sleeping boy up the grand staircase, his heart echoing the heavy thud of his boots on the marble. Inside the suite, he engaged the deadbolts and laid Leo on the bed. He paced the room, his Omega instinct screaming at him. The house felt different tonight. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. He needed water. His throat was parched from the smoke and screaming. The suite had a small kitchenette, but the pitcher was empty. He hesitated at the door. Open it for no one. But the hallway was clear, and the main kitchen was just down the service stairs. He unlocked the door silently and slipped out. The hallway was dim, lit only by emergency lights. He moved toward the service staircase, the one the staff used. As he reached the landing, he heard a voice. A whisper. Frantic. Hushed. Coming from the laundry chute alcove. It's done. Rocco is down. No, Dante is alive. I can't. You promised no one would get hurt. Ethan froze. He knew that voice. Greta. He pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear. I opened the service gate, Greta hissed. The code is 7734. Yes, the cameras are looped. Please, just don't hurt my grandson. You said you'd let him go if I planted the bug. Ethan's hand flew to his mouth. The bug in the bear. The bad feeling he'd had about the housekeeper. It wasn't just dislike, it was intuition. Greta wasn't the mastermind. She was a grandmother being blackmailed. But her desperation had just opened the front door to hell. They're coming now. Okay. Click. The call ended. Ethan didn't retreat to the room. There wasn't time. If the service gate was open, Salvatore's men were already on the grounds. The guards at the front gate were looking the wrong way. He turned and ran, not to Leo, but to Dante. He burst into the study. Dante was stitching his own arm, a bottle of whiskey open on the desk. He looked up, eyes narrowing dangerously. I told you to stay. Greta, Ethan gasped out. It's Greta. She opened the service gate. They're here. Dante didn't ask if he was sure. He didn't waste a second. He grabbed a heavy handgun from his desk and hit a red button on the wall. The siren began to wail throughout the house, a low, mournful sound. Get Leo, he said, his voice calm, terrifyingly steady. Go to the panic room in the cellar. Do not. Crash. The sound came from downstairs. Glass breaking. Gunfire. Too late. Dante growled, racking the slide of his gun. They're inside. He looked at Ethan, and for the first time, Ethan saw fear in the eyes of the devil of Chicago. Not for himself, for them. Stay behind me, Dante ordered. If I fall, you pick up the gun and you shoot anything that isn't me or Leo. Can you do that? Ethan thought of the boy upstairs. He thought of the alpha standing in front of him, bleeding for his family. Yes, he said. They moved into the hallway. It was chaos. The lights had been cut. the corridor lit only by the muzzle flashes of gunfire erupting from the foyer below. "Leo!" Ethan screamed, sprinting toward the bedroom. He reached the door. It was ajar. His blood turned to ice. He locked it. "Leo!" He burst into the room. The bed was empty. The window was open, the cold November wind billowing the curtains. Ethan ran to the window. A ladder was propped against the sill. Below, on the lawn, he saw two dark shapes dragging a small, struggling figure toward the tree line. "Dante!" he screamed, his voice tearing with raw panic. "They have him. They're taking him to the river." Dante appeared beside him. He looked out the window, saw the figures, and his face went blank. A look of pure, unadulterated death. "Stay here," he said. "No." Ethan grabbed his arm. "I can swim. You can't catch them in the water." Dante looked at him, really looked at him. He saw the fire in his eyes, the stubborn refusal to be left behind. The Omega was gone. The survivor remained. "Move," he said. They didn't take the stairs. They went out the window, sliding down the ladder the kidnappers had used. They hit the grass running. Gunfire erupted around them. Dante returned fire, dropping a man who stepped out from the shadows. Ethan didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the small beige coat disappearing into the dark woods near the riverbank. They were heading for the boathouse. Salvatore wasn't just kidnapping Leo. He was going to finish what he started. He was going to drown the air. "Cover me," Dante yelled, breaking cover and drawing the fire of 3 men guarding the path. Ethan used the distraction. He ducked under the low branches of the weeping willows, sprinting toward the water. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he didn't slow down. He reached the boathouse just as the engine of a speedboat roared to life. The boat was untied, drifting away from the dock. In the stern, a massive man held Leo by the scruff of his neck. At the wheel was Salvatore Moretti himself, laughing into the wind. "Too slow, sweetheart," Salvatore yelled over the engine's roar. Ethan stood on the edge of the dock. The boat was 10 feet away. 15. He didn't think about the cold. He didn't think about the bullets. He ran. He hit the end of the wooden dock and launched himself into the air. It was a desperate, impossible leap. His fingers scrabbled against the slick fiberglass hull of the boat. He slammed into the side, his ribs cracking against the railing. But he held on. He dragged himself over the gunwale, gasping. "What the?" The guard holding Leo turned. Ethan didn't have a weapon. He had rage. He kicked the guard squarely in the knee. The joint snapped with a sickening pop, and the man howled, dropping Leo. "Get down, Leo!" Ethan screamed. The boy scrambled under the dashboard. Salvatore abandoned the wheel, pulling a gold-plated revolver from his jacket. "You persistent little rat!" The boat swerved wildly, throwing Ethan off balance. He slid across the wet deck. Salvatore aimed the gun at his chest. Click. Misfire. Ethan scrambled for a flare gun mounted on the wall of the boat. He ripped it free. Salvatore fixed the jam and raised the gun again. "Goodbye, waiter." Ethan didn't aim for him. He aimed for the pile of spare fuel canisters stacked in the corner behind him. He pulled the trigger. The flare hissed through the air, a streak of red phosphorus. It hit the canister. Boom. The explosion rocked the boat. A wall of fire erupted between Ethan and Salvatore. The old Don screamed as the heat engulfed the rear of the vessel. "Jump, Leo!" Ethan grabbed the boy. "I can't swim," Leo shrieked, paralyzed by the black water. "I can," Ethan yelled. "Trust me." He wrapped his arms around Leo, shielding his head, and threw them both over the side. They hit the freezing water. The shock was just as bad as the first time, but this time Ethan had a mission. He kicked hard, surfacing away from the burning wreck of the boat. Debris rained down around them. The boat was a floating inferno, drifting downstream. "Hold on to me," Ethan gasped, treading water. "I've got you." From the shore, a spotlight hit them. Ethan squinted against the glare. Was it Moretti's men? Was this the end? Ethan. The voice was rough, broken. Donna. He was wading into the river, his expensive suit ruined, the water up to his chest. He reached out his hand. Ethan kicked toward him, his strength failing, the cold seeping into his bones. Dante grabbed his arm, pulling them both toward him, crushing them against his chest. He was shaking. The invincible Mafia boss was shaking. He carried them both to the bank and collapsed on the grass, Leo sandwiched between them. Is he dead? Dante asked, looking at the burning boat. He's gone, Ethan whispered, his teeth chattering. It's over. Dante looked down at him, his hair matted with river water, his dress torn, his face bruised. You saved him, Dante said, his voice thick with emotion. Again. That's my job. Ethan managed a weak smile. It's in the contract. Dante laughed, a dry, rusty sound that was somehow real. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against Ethan's. Contract is void, he whispered. Does that mean I'm fired? No. Dante brushed a wet strand of hair from Ethan's face. It means you're promoted. Permanent position. He kissed him. It was cold and wet, tasted of river water and smoke, but it was the warmest thing Ethan had ever felt. Dante's scent enveloped him, sandalwood and whiskey and something else, something that made his omega instinct sing with rightness. Papa. They broke apart. Leo was sitting up, wrapped in Dante's jacket. He looked at the burning boat, then at Ethan. Did you explode the bad man? Leo asked. Ethan hesitated. Oh, yeah. Leo nodded solemnly. Cool. Dante threw his head back and laughed, the sound of pure relief echoing into the Chicago night. 6 months later. The spring sun was warm on the terrace. Ethan sat with a book, watching Leo chase a new puppy, a golden retriever named Spark, across the lawn. The security was still there, but it was discreet now. The fear was gone. The glass door opened. Dante walked out. He wasn't wearing a suit, just jeans and a black t-shirt. He looked 10 years younger. He placed a cup of coffee on the table and sat on the arm of Ethan's chair. Greta's trial starts today, he said quietly. Did she take the plea deal? Ethan asked. She did. She gave up everyone in Salvatore's organization who survived the purge. She'll do 5 years in minimum security. Her grandson is safe. Ethan nodded. Dante took his hand, running his thumb over the inside of his wrist, the spot where a mating mark should be, but wasn't. He'd asked once if Ethan wanted to be marked, but Ethan had said no. Not yet. He wanted to be sure it was his choice, not just instinct. And Dante had respected that. But they'd done something else. Something that meant more than any mark could. Dante had given Ethan the ring on his finger. Not a diamond, too cliché, but a sapphire deep in blue. The color of the river at night. The color of the moment their lives had changed forever. You know, Dante mused, looking at his son laughing in the grass. I spent my whole life building an empire to leave to him. Money, power, soldiers. I thought that was what kept you safe. He looked at Ethan, his gray eyes soft. I was wrong. It's not the soldiers. It's the person who's willing to jump in the water when everyone else runs away. Ethan squeezed his hand. Well, don't get used to it. The water was freezing. I know. Dante smiled, leaning down to kiss him. I'll keep you warm. Leo ran over, the puppy barking at his heels. Papa. Dad. Spark dug a hole. They looked at each other and smiled. It wasn't a perfect life. It was still a dangerous world. But as Ethan looked at the two Valenti men, he knew one thing for sure. They would never drown again. Then,